I can have my 3-year-old run it in. We are live. Hi, I'm Charles from GMAT Ninja, GMAT Club's resident verbal expert, here today, not to talk about the GMAT, but we're talking through the latest US News MBA report rankings release. I'm here with 4 of my very favorite admissions consultants. We have Cera from Stratus, Neil Chong from Veritas Prep, Harold Simansky, mbaMission, and the legendary Wich Vila from ApplicantLab.com. So I'm going to start everybody with a really simple question about their impressions of the rankings release. As most of you have probably joined some of our live events before, but if you have any questions, pop it into the comments. I'll do my best to get to as many of these as we can. We've got 45 minutes. So pop those questions in early, increases the odds we'll be able to get to them. So I'm just going to go around and just say, hey, what's your first impression of this year's rankings? What changed? What caught your eye? Let's go ahead and start with you, Susan.
So first impression, no meaningful changes in my mind, kind of same players are all in there. 2 things though, was that Stanford's acceptance rate went up in my mind, significantly. I am typically telling people, 6 out of 100 people get into Stanford, and this year it was 9 out of 100. So I don't know if their application volume was down leading into the pandemic. That may be what drove it. And the other thing that I noted is that on average, I think all the average GMATs are down. And I suspect that's because there are a lot of internationals who are known for bringing in high GMAT scores that didn't end up sitting in seats this past fall.
Let's go to Harold next. What's your first impressions of the rankings?
Yeah, I have to be honest with you, just a big yawn here. I didn't see anything particularly meaningful. I think at the end of the day, the limitations of rankings are really shown in terms of, do they capture present data? Are any interesting schools bubbling up? And the answer is probably not. So for me, it was just another tool of many that I help with, that I have clients use when they think about the schools they want to apply to.
And Neil, is there anything for you besides a yawn?
Yeah, I mean, really no movement, no change, minimal movement within the top 20. We still see the ties. Harvard number 5. I'll touch upon USC Marshall, me being an alum, it moving from 17 to 16, and UCLA Anderson going from 16 to 18. That did surprise me because historically Anderson has always been ahead of Marshall in the rankings. So we're pleased with that, but what's really stood out there is that the employment rate at Marshall, and I think this is what drove the numbers there, is 91.3% 3 months after graduation, while Anderson was at 78%. So considering the fact that Anderson really is known for its excellent career center, I'm sure they're a little bit disappointed and surprised at what happened there. And then, Marshall does have a new dean in place. They came over from Wharton in July of 2020. So it appears like he's making a big impact there. But that's all I had.
Outstanding, thank you. And Maria, anything catch your eye?
Yeah, I mean, nothing that hasn't already been said. I like that Carnegie Mellon is starting to get some of the accolades I think it's deserved. I think that's been an underrated program for quite some time. But yeah, some of the other ones, Neil, I'm glad that you disclosed that you're a USC alum, because I was about to jump on the fact that UCLA being behind USC to me as an Angelina living in LA is like, I don't necessarily agree with that, but the numbers came out the way they came out. Look, I think that these US News, all of these rankings need to drive clicks. And so the more controversial, the better. Otherwise, we wouldn't have anything to talk about and no one would be asking any questions. So I think that in terms of rankings, we always need to think about the motivations of who the people are publishing the rankings, and especially US News, because they do charge, I believe, it's $4 for you to be able to access a lot of it. So just keep that in mind.
I mean, the one thing that is raging a little bit on the forum is that Harvard ended up at number 5 this year. And anybody feel free to jump in on this. Can you put that into context a little bit? Is that something that applicants should look at and go, oh, maybe Harvard isn't quite the amazing beacon on the hill that we think it is? Does that mean that Harvard's slipping in some way? Is that some commentary on the quality of the program, or do you see that as noise?
A lot of noise in my mind. Yeah, a lot of noise.
Getting a lot of nods. Good.
In my mind, I would not be concerned with US News ranking Harvard number 5. We all know it's a great program, so I wouldn't be concerned.
Yeah, I would focus instead of the overall ranking, look at, they're still getting 4.9s from their peers and they're still being ranked very highly by recruiters. I suspect that it was driven down by the number of HBS alums who were not employed at the, 3 months out of graduation because they're trying to do something entrepreneurial. And that comes back and bites you a little bit in the rankings, for better or for worse. I don't think it is any slight on Harvard and the education that you get there.
Yeah, I want to tread carefully on these because I went to Harvard, and so people are like, oh, well, of course she's going to say that it's, it's not fit. But I think legitimately, I would say that, one of the things that I see just working with clients who get into all of these programs is a lot of them, I don't get a lot of people emailing me and saying, oh my gosh, I got into Harvard, but it's ranked 5th. So should I go to this other program? Aside from Stanford, Harvard doesn't really lose people to other schools for the most part. But I do get people saying, oh, I got into Booth. That's cool, but I'm really disappointed. Should I reapply to Harvard next year? Right. Or should I, I'm on the wait list at Harvard. Like, how do I get yeah, I'm in at Booth or I'm in at Cal. And so I feel like that sentiment is, I feel like if I were in charge of rankings, that's something that I would weigh pretty heavily is where do people want to go? So I think it's noise. I think it's, if they didn't make it controversial, we wouldn't be talking about it. So.
One of the other things that I think has got people's eye on the forum is the employment numbers, which given the state of the world right now in the pandemic, the panelists here may or may not be wearing any pants. Economy has not been at its best and brightest over the last year or so, but it looks like average salaries and bonuses actually went up at every school. Average increase was 4%. Is there any explanation for this, that somehow the salaries and bonuses have looked great in these numbers despite the volatility in the job market? Go ahead, Susan.
My thought, Charles, is that a lot of people have offers coming out of the summer internships in 2019, and no one's going to change. You're not going to take that away or change the amount that was granted. I don't know exactly the percentages, but plenty of people already had secured jobs before March 1 or March 15th, wherever we want to call it, that the pandemic shut things down. And I think the salary numbers and the employment numbers show the value of this degree, that you're still going to get a job with an MBA. Maybe your degree in French literature from undergrad is going to leave you out looking for a job for a little bit longer, but a business degree holds its value regardless of what's going on in the economy worldwide.
Any other thoughts on that? Neil, Harold, Maria?
Yeah, I mean, listen, Susan already touched on it, which is this idea here of some of these numbers are deceiving in the sense of if folks are going to go off and do something entrepreneurial, then the reality is that you're going to see obviously salary numbers fall way down. You're also going to see length of time before you get a job go way down. And I think it sort of, there's a real tension here in the sense of, okay, what do you really do with these numbers? I just want to highlight one school, and which I think it actually is going to be surprising to people. Probably the school that does best with regard to career services is University of Washington in Foster. If you look closely at the number, you see, wow, 95% of their applicants are employed really right away. And that's something for people to keep in mind, just as they think about maybe some international students as they think about landing here. But you know what? I got to get a job. I have to get a job fast, and I need a job at a brand name. And a place like Foster does that very effectively.
And I think adding on to Harold's point, I think one of the things that people often overlook when they're looking at programs is the geography, right? Foster's in Seattle, so is Amazon, so is Microsoft.
Yeah.
When you actually go to school in a city where these companies are, you can make side projects for them. It's a lot easier to develop those relationships. And so I think that that's a big thing that people often don't think about sometimes. Like they're like, oh, I want to work on Wall Street, so let me go to a school in the middle. And I'm like, no, try to get close to New York. That's what you want to do. Other thing on top of, not only do some people try to start entrepreneurial ventures, but I also think that at certain schools, I think maybe some students are more willing to hold out for that good job, right? So Harvard's numbers were pretty low, but I wonder if part of it is the Harvard graduates saying like, you know what, the economy right now is in the trash can. I'm just going to wait 6 months and I'm not going to just, go to plan B. That could be a part of it too.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I mean, MBA graduates will continue to be in demand. Building on Harold's point, I was working with a client from Foster, and what really struck him was that the fact that they were very customer focused, very customer oriented in terms of their applicants and outreach to them and engagement with the community and all that. So I guess what I would really recommend to all the applicants seeking to apply to MBA programs is, make sure it's a good fit, look at the programs, do your due diligence research, and, they're all going to be a great program, but you got to find the right program for yourself, right?
And I want to run a little bit more with Harold's point about, well, some schools do just a fantastic job of placing students, even if they're a little bit lower in the rankings. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about some of the undervalued programs that are doing amazing things, particularly in terms of career services. So I guess maybe we'll go on the horn here quickly. So Susan, is there any particular programs that you think get underappreciated, that you think in terms of a certain type of student or in terms of placement overall, that you think is doing an amazing job at landing opportunities for their students, but we're not talking about them because they're not Harvard?
Yeah, interestingly, I had a conversation with a woman a couple of days ago who wants to go into entrepreneurship, and she was throwing out Stanford and Berkeley Haas because she wants to do something meaningful. And as she's talking, I'm thinking she should be really looking at Babson. Babson never falls in the conversation of top 25 overall, but once again this year, it's the top school for entrepreneurship. If that's where you want to go, Babson could be the school for you. So be thinking about the industry, the function, whether you want to be working for yourself or for a big established company when you graduate, and let that inform your decision making.
Neil?
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, I'll look at it from a macro perspective. It's more about, your engagement with admissions, your engagement with potentially the career center. Again, finding out, what companies recruit on campus, how well do they do in terms of preparing MBA candidates for the next step in their careers. So again, really just vetting out that information and doing your due diligence as you apply for these different programs.
Maria, any particular favorites or any schools catch your eye?
Yeah, I mean, I think Babson is perennially underappreciated. I think, Susan, you and I were both, did we visit Babson? Were you at the Babson tour? I know at the AGAT conference.
Babson tour, unfortunately, that year. That was my first year on the conference, and I missed it.
Okay, well, I mean, it'll be surprising for any of you. Their stuff is amazing. Like all of their classrooms are set. They have so many maker spaces. They have a program that is actually, it gives visas to foreign students who want to, it's like a special visa program that they developed in order for students who want to start companies. I don't remember the specifics, but I know as of a few years ago, it was like this unique visa program to help you stay in the States if you want to start a company. I mean, I think, again, I think geography plays a much bigger role than people often like to give it, like to think about. And I think another, on top of reaching out to career services, as Neil said, I think also reaching out to the student clubs, because I think the students, especially the second year students, they don't have a whole lot to lose. And so they're going to be really honest with you about like, yeah, you know what? None of us, only 2 of us got jobs in private equity this year. It was a bloodbath, right? And so they're going to be the ones or no, anyone who wanted a consulting job, we all got consulting jobs. Yay. So they're going to be the ones to really be the sort of the feet on the ground or boots on the ground, as it were, to tell you what's actually happening with recruiting.
Harold, did you want to jump back in? You got us rolling with the Foster or any others you'd like to highlight?
Sure. Cornell. I happen to love Cornell for a couple different reasons. First of all, if you want a job in investment banking, they've done a wonderful history of getting people investment banking jobs. They have a specific track for it. They ship you down to New York City to meet with folks on the street. It's really, when someone says they want to go into investment banking, certainly Cornell should be, near the top of your list. Also, Cornell just built this huge campus in New York City on Roosevelt Island, $1 billion campus to house Cornell Tech. Real strong ties. In fact, the program used to be housed where Google is. So real strong ties to the entrepreneurial community in New York City. Obviously, again, very strong entrepreneurial community in New York City. Plus, if you're an MBA in Ithaca, there are weekends you can spend at Cornell Tech. There are weeks you can spend at Cornell Tech. There's a semester you can spend at Cornell Tech. So Cornell, you want to be an entrepreneur, you want to be an investment banker, and of course, the consulting shops are always there. I think it should be considered by basically everybody. I really consider it a top 10 school in my mind.
Perfect. Thank you, Harold. Had a question earlier from Double Whammy that Booth usually ranks at par with Wharton in many rankings. So why are we still talking about Harvard, Stanford, Wharton as this unbreakable trifecta? Does anybody have a sense of that or want to weigh in on kind of how we think about that triumvirate in the context of rankings and where the value really is?
Sure.
Feel free to jump in, any of you.
Yeah.
Go for it, Harold.
Maria,
and then we'll go to Maria next.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, I think one of the things is that when we look at how the US News rankings are created, I believe the peer opinion is about 25%. So they ask other deans of other business schools, what do you think of this program? Which I think is pretty problematic in general, because deans are usually lifelong academics, or they're essentially quasi-retired business people. And so as academics, what do they value? They value things like publishing. They value things like research. And so I have no doubt that Chicago Booth is super strong in research, right? I mean, you know, Chicago is famous going back 40, 50 years for their economics. You know, in Latin America, there was a huge influence of the Chicago Us Thinking School of Economics in Latin American economics. So I just think that, you know, I think that the reason that Booth does very well, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is that I think they're the peer deans respect them. But I wonder if a lot of that is based on sort of the intellectual rigor of the publishing that their faculty is doing, and perhaps not so much on other things. I would also point out that I think that the acceptance rate at Booth is pretty surprisingly kind of high. I think it's in the upper 20s. And so I do think that from a selectivity viewpoint, I just think that people, they tend to get into Booth more frequently than they get into perhaps some of the other programs. And so that mystique, eliteness of the gatekeepers from the other programs, I think it still holds, because if you know a lot of people who got in, you know, 10 people who got into Booth, but only 2 who got into Stanford, you're going to think that Stanford's a bit higher no matter what.
Okay, I'm going to go to some of these questions. We've got some really good stuff coming in about scholarship money. One is actually directed specifically for Susan from SC. Thoughts on lower ranked business schools providing scholarships, let's say more scholarship money versus some of the higher ranked schools?
Yeah, great. On that. Sure, like the initials SC, my twin out there. So, you know, typically we don't see a lot of scholarship money, merit scholarship, going to people, you know, coming from those M7 schools. Certainly not Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton, although we did have a couple of clients this year who got money at Wharton, and one very generous, which was turned down to go to HBS. In any case, in the lower ranked schools, there are definitely people, you know, definitely more money to be had. And I often say, look at the profiles of these schools. And some of that data isn't in the US News, so you may need to go to the specific school profiles for their first year classes right now. But look at, you know, do they have a lower percentage of women? So if you're a woman and you want to be going to a top 25 school, I might look at, you know, echoing Harold's love for Cornell. Cornell's first year class is only about 30% women in it this year. Every single woman we've worked with at Stratus got into Cornell. 7 out of 8 of them got scholarship. There's money for women at Cornell this year. Similarly, also probably for Carnegie Mellon, which Maria mentioned as a great school. They were lower in their percentage of women. So, you know, if you're a woman and you're here listening, look for those schools that have lower percentage of women than their peer schools. If you're international, look for schools that, in this year's numbers in US News are going to be a bit off due to the fact that a lot of internationals were not able to get here. But if you look at historical class averages of internationals, there might be a place for you at a school that doesn't have as many international students. A couple that come to mind are Texas. Also, IU Kelly and Notre Dame, I think, are typically very low on internationals and may have some willingness to bring in internationals to increase the diversity of their class. So those would be some things that I'd be looking for, to look for money.
Anybody else want to weigh in on the scholarship question? So go ahead and let your mic up.
Listen, I think pretty frequently people are not thinking about scholarships as they think about school selection. So this idea here of, okay, I would never go to a school that isn't, you know, an M7 school. You know, frequently say to my client, you mean you'd never go to a top 20 school if it were free? You know, and the reality is that once you think about it that way, where you're holding those two letters. One is you've been accepted to maybe an M7 school. The other is you've been accepted to a school that's ranked 12th, 13th, 14th with a full scholarship. Then suddenly I think people's minds start to change.
I love it, and I'm stealing that line. Neil or Maria, do you want to jump in on the scholarships at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just build on Harold's point. Yeah, I mean, obviously everybody's personal situation is different, but looking into the economics of your unique situation, if you're offered a decent amount of money, then you should probably take that into consideration as you evaluate your school options. So don't just throw out the fact that it's not necessarily an M7. If it's a rank 10 and you could do just as well down the road from a career perspective, then consider that scholarship and keep that in mind.
I'm just going to add to Harold's point super quick that, yeah, people might not think about scholarships when they're applying, but they definitely think about them once they get in and they see the sticker price and they realize just how much, oh no, like I didn't get a scholarship at that M7 school. You mean I really have to take out $150,000 net? Yes, you do. So I think that's a good thing to also point out to people at the beginning. Like, are you really comfortable if you get into these schools and you have to take out a loan that in some cases could buy you a house? Are you really comfortable with that?
This is kind of making me think about value. And we have a question in from one of our viewers, Swathi, and she's asking about, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. It's a question about one-year MBA courses. And she's asking specifically about for more experienced candidates. I have 10 years of experience. I'm over 30, would love some insights into these. And I guess I'm curious about this in a couple different dimensions. I think one is, we tend to look at the rankings and go, oh, I want to get in the highest ranked I can. Once you get over 30, let's say, how might you think about fit in a full-time versus, let's say, a one-year MBA or an executive MBA would be one dimension of it. And I guess the other question I'd have for you guys is, well, how do you think about value in that case? Because when you have this proliferation of one-year programs, a lot of which didn't exist 10, 20 years ago, well, it lowers the cost. And how might an applicant think about that as well as they're trying to make a decision about where to apply?
I can jump in on that. And one thing that we often talk to our clients about in terms of finding the right fit schools for them is, what are their career goals? Are they trying to change their career? Are they trying to pivot? Are they going to need an internship to make that move? Or perhaps if they're 30 plus, maybe they're just trying to retool so they can accelerate the career that they're already in which case, maybe a one-year full-time and return back to where you were works. Maybe a part-time program works, or maybe an executive MBA program works. And again, the economics are different. In some instances, executive MBAs are going part-time and they're getting tuition reimbursement from their company. That can be meaningful and have an impact on that ROI. There are, a couple of great one-year programs for mid-career executives, and it's important that it's not you just have 10 years of experience. You have to be at a certain level to be in the consideration set for schools like MIT Sloan Fellows or Stanford MSX program or the LBS Sloan Fellows. So your age is not the only factor. It's kind of where you are and what you've done. Cornell has a great one-year program. If you already have a master's degree, a JD, if you have a CFA or a CPA or maybe some of the Six Sigma designations will help you to get into that 1 year at Cornell. So hopefully that gives some food for thought. Everything's a very unique decision, though, for the candidate.
Yes. So when I have discussions with clients, what I do is I try and tell them, reverse engineer your life, reverse engineer your career, 5 years, 10 years down the road, envision where you want to be, and think about the programs that you're considering. And is it the one-year program? Is it the EMBA? Is it a part-time program? What program is going to be the best fit for you to achieve your career goals to get to where you want to be 5 years, 10 years down the road?
I guess a related question, I'll use Shobik's version of it here. So how do you see people using these rankings? And I think collectively the five of us have some skepticism about the rankings, and I think we tend to look at them a little bit too narrowly and say, oh, number 5 is way better than number 7, when it may or may not be. But how can rankings be used well by your clients? And what are, I think we all agree on reasons why they maybe shouldn't obsess over the rankings. But do you find those rankings having a useful purpose as you work with your clients? And maybe pick on Harold first for this one.
Yeah, and we were just talking about, all of us were talking about the fact that maybe the rankings are more valuable in terms of the schools you've never heard of. It's very easy when we have clients come to us. Yes, I know you want to apply to Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton, and Booth, and MIT. It's like, that's easy. We encourage it, by all means, really shoot for the stars. At the same point, then pause and think to yourself, okay, again, layer in scholarships, maybe layering in where business schools send a lot of their graduates. Then suddenly you can look at the rankings and start seeing schools like Olin, Washington in St. Louis, wonderful school for entrepreneurs. Owen in Nashville, Vanderbilt, great place if you want to go into pharma. And I think if you use the rankings somewhat, in some way strategically, layering on a couple of other things like scholarships, like the place where you want to be, I think they're a very useful tool.
Maria, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the one good thing about the rankings is that they aggregate a lot of data for you, so you don't have to go hunting. Oh, what's the average GMAT score? What are, so from that perspective, I think it's useful. I also think it could be useful in terms of, trying to get a sense of your own candidacy against some of them. So for example, it's interesting. When I work with international students, sometimes some of them have never really heard of a Booth, for example, right? Or they've heard of Yale, but they've never heard of Booth. And so when I say to them something like, yeah, well, technically Booth is, it's a quote unquote better school in the rankings, they're like, well, what do you mean? I've never heard of it. And so I think that that's a point that's already been made, but especially for people who are not from the United States, who might not know the ins and outs of culture and our different schools, I think it can be very useful.
Neil, Susan, anything else to add on usefulness of rankings?
Yeah. So from my perspective, I mean, I think it provides really a good starting point. Again, if you're not necessarily familiar with all the different MBA programs, there's going to be some programs in there, some schools that you're unfamiliar with. It will allow you to, research those further. But as I advise clients, think again about the fit. Look into the culture of that particular school and whether or not you're going to feel comfortable with. Again, think about career services. And then, if you have a chance, visit the schools, the programs in person, engage with the community, speak with current students, admissions, alums, etc. So that, again, as you figure out what schools you want to apply to, you'll really have a good sense and feel of which programs are going to be that good fit for you.
I'm going to take up one more very kind of rankings-based question, and I apologize again for the mispronunciation if I'm not saying this right, but Satyajit's question, what does it mean when a school slips in the ranking? So in this particular round, Notre Dame made a pretty big drop, and so did Washington University here in the 2021 rankings. What kind of context can you put that in? Is that meaningful? Is that something that should make an applicant maybe hesitate when they think about applying to Notre Dame, for example? Susan, would you like to take that one up?
Yeah, I'll take that. Frankly, 1 year is just a hiccup. It's 1 year where, the pandemic may have hit Notre Dame. I didn't dig down into their placement numbers and percentages at graduation and 3 months out, but that can hit you pretty hard. I would say that this past year, the dean's evaluation of other schools did not change dramatically, nor did the recruiters' assessments of these schools. That's 40% of these numbers. So the drop is, when you look at the raw numbers, and I didn't see them this year, but added out of 100, you get down to 20 through 30, and they're all 1 or 2 points apart. I see Maria going like this. It's tiny. It's as Harold said, a yawn. It's really not really very meaningful. Notre Dame is Notre Dame. It has been Notre Dame for hundreds of years, and it will continue to produce great leaders in business and other roles moving forward.
Anybody else want to weigh in on the issue of dropping? Go for it, Maria.
I think super quick. I think if you're entering this process the way all of us would encourage you to, which is thinking first about what do I want and which program's going to get that for me. If you live in a certain part of the country, for example, and if you want a certain type of education, Notre Dame is going to be a great choice for you regardless of where it is in the ranking. So if you enter the process, I wouldn't start with the rankings necessarily, because I think that leads people astray. But if you're actually doing that research and that introspection up front, Notre Dame might be the #1 school for you, regardless of whether or not one year it's, in the 15th or whatever. Like those fluctuations don't really matter. For example, I often tell people in terms of if you want to go work one day at a Netflix or at at Fox or Disney, guess what? The #1 school for you is probably UCLA, and #2 is probably USC if you have zero entertainment background experience, right? Because when you come to LA, you will be able to network with the studios, you'll be able to take internships with them, you'll be able to do, so that's it's the same thing with UCLA versus USC. Like I don't think that that fluctuation should really matter if you're entering this process with your end goals in mind.
It's actually a related question that Arsh, and again, apologies for mispronunciations, just asked, are there any MBA rankings by specializations? And the answer to that is very much yes. Do we see a trend of certain electives or specializations performing better than others? And I guess maybe the embedded question there is, how seriously should you take those rankings by specialization? How useful do you find those as you're guiding clients? And go ahead and pick on Harold first for this one.
Yeah, I actually like rankings by specialization, if only to get people really understanding that the traditional stereotype of what schools are and what they do is actually probably a little bit off. So is Booth just a finance school? No, it has a great entrepreneurship community. Is MIT just a tech school? No, I have to tell you, they do a lot of organizational behavior and a lot of leadership development. And I think you can go through every school and suddenly there are a few aha moments, including something like, I want to just shout out to it, which is University of Wisconsin. Again, people don't think about it much. They don't hear about it much. The reality is, if you want to go into brand management, that's a great place to be.
Perfect. Neil, anything to say on the specializations?
Yeah, I'm definitely something as applicants are looking into the different programs that you definitely want to take a look at from the perspective of what they're known for and the industries and all that. So from that perspective, yes, have it somewhat top of mind, but again, think overall fit of the program. But yeah, that's something that you really should look into, though.
We have a question here about how to compare European programs to the US ones. And I guess since we're here mostly to discuss the rankings, obviously the US News Enrolled Report rankings don't try to put US and European or other international schools side by side. But would any of you like to weigh in on how you might think about how you might compare overall quality of schools and how effective are these ranking systems that do try to compare schools across borders? Susan or Maria?
So I think one thing to consider with the European programs is many of them are 1 year. And if you want to end up in Europe, you might want to go to a European school. So if you're a European or you're from Asia and you want to end up in Europe, coming to the US is probably not your best bet. INSEAD might be a great choice. ESA, LBS, any of these schools that are going to put you feet on the ground. Just as Maria was saying, you want to go to media and entertainment, get yourself in LA. You want to be on Wall Street, even being in Ithaca is going to help you there. If you want to be in Europe, go to school in Europe. You'll be finished faster, take on less debt. There are great opportunities. There are wonderful schools there. But again, look at what their specializations are, what their job placement is. If you want to be doing something in kind of social enterprise or social entrepreneurship, Oxford's a great program. If you want to be in technology, LBS, finance, LBS, consulting, INSEAD. Think as Neil talked to the end goal and reverse engineer it. So the end goal is not just your industry, but also your geography.
Since you mentioned consulting, we've had, I think, 2 or 3 different questions pop up that mention MBB, so McKinsey, Bain, BCG. And I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts on, so if somebody's goal is really to end up at one of those 3 schools, how should they think about the rankings? Is it just a game of, oh, I've got to be at the highest ranked school I can, it's going to increase my chances? Is it, I've got to be in the top 10, the top 15, the top 20? If you have somebody that's really determined to go to one of those top consultancies, what's your advice for how to think about the rankings? And I'll pick on Maria first for this one.
Yeah, I think that the rank people seem to think sometimes that it's a linear thing. Like if I go to the number 2 8 school, and I don't think that's really true, right? I think the best way to get a job at an MBB is to practice case interviews as much as you possibly can and blow them out of the water when you get that interview. And then it doesn't really matter if you're at a number 1 school or number 15. I think, yeah, they might have more spots in some of the offices. And also I think, for example, if you're at UT Austin, you're more likely to get a job in the Houston office of McKinsey versus the New York office. So there are some variations therein, but if getting into that company is what matters most to you, it's going to come down a lot more to your performance in those very grueling and difficult interviews, as opposed to like school number 7 is viewed as less school number 5 or something.
One thing, an interesting anecdote that I've observed this year is up until this admission cycle, I've always been telling my clients, and now I'm realizing that I'm wrong, and I admit that I am wrong, that to get even the interview at MBB, you need a GMAT of 730 or more. So take the GMAT instead of the GRE. But I've got some anecdotal evidence this year from a handful of former clients who are all going to MBB, none of whom have a 730 plus GMAT. And I've got 5 different people, either have internships with guaranteed return offers or full-time offers at all 3 of these companies. And they're not in a top 10 school per these US News rankings. Lots of different things, LGBTQ identified, people who speak a second language that's not Mandarin or Spanish. All these things are being taken into account in the value you could add at a company like, at one of the MBB firms.
Yeah, go for it, Harold.
Yeah. Listen, I also think you have to be very careful. The reality is that McKinsey's going to go to INSEAD and they're going to take 50. McKinsey is, yes, they recruit everywhere, but they're going to go to Boston University and take 1. So the reality is you really have to not just look at where McKinsey is recruiting, but you also have to understand how many people from that class are actually going to that particular school. And it's not, as Maria said, it's not linear. The reality is that you can go to some of these schools that are 7 to 12, and the reality is you will have a very good shot equal to any of the other schools.
We have a question about Kellogg specifically, because they did a lot of really interesting things in terms of admissions last year. As the pandemic started to hit, went test optional, started opening up additional rounds of admissions. They didn't really move in the rankings. And do you have any thoughts on that? Where this is taking us? Do we have a new trend here in terms of how admissions policies work? And are you surprised that really nothing much happened in the rankings as a result?
I'll jump in if no one else does. If you look at the percentages, the things that are being measured in the rankings don't include what happened from April 1 perhaps last year when Kellogg said no tests are needed. That might have helped them in increasing their GMAT score because they were able to look at a more diverse set of people and not have any downside risk of having it lower their GMAT score overall. But the acceptance rate is worth 1.25% of the overall assessment. So them having a huge denominator didn't move the needle at all. What will be interesting to see is 2 years from now, when the people who came in without a test score, who perhaps are, assessed differently in the application process, how they perform when getting jobs on the way out. And I'm hopeful that Kellogg did a great assessment of those individuals, and the 2 years they spend at Kellogg are going to prepare them well to have the same success as all other Kellogg graduates when they graduate in 2023, or 2022 rather.
Go for it, Harold.
Yeah, I just want to touch on one small point here, which is the question of being test optional. I mean, we've started to see it more. We're starting to see it at many of the top schools. The reality is that's really a double-edged sword, and people have to understand that. If you have a 2.6 coming out of undergrad, never having taken a quantitative course, you want to be able to take that GMAT. You really want to prove something and just show what your kind of quantitative abilities are. At the same point, if you're a math major, I've never met a dumb math major. Okay, at that point, you can say, for me, I'm simply not taking the GMAT. So I think you have to really know yourself as a candidate and where your weak points are. And actually, GMAT or GRE could be very helpful as far as your candidacy goes.
Go for it.
I just really, I like to quip that test optional doesn't mean brain optional. So you have to Harold's point, you still have to be able to demonstrate that you'll be able to handle the academic rigor. And in fact, for many people, the standardized test can be a gift if they haven't had an opportunity in the past.
And we're down to our last 5 minutes here. I'm getting a bunch of questions in all sorts of forms here from the live crowd about international applicants. And I'll start with Neil on this one. I guess, what are you seeing in the data so far, and how do you think it's impacted the rankings as far as the number of international applicants? Obviously, US schools, we had some really odd stuff going on with visas for all sorts of reasons, pandemic and politics and otherwise. What are you seeing in terms of international students' odds and how successful they were in this past round?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the pandemic and how that impacted everybody, I mean, you think about some schools implementing deferrals and things like that, whether it was Tepper or Harvard, things like that. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the applicant base and submissions, I would think they would have been somewhat down as a result of the uncertainty of the pandemic. But then again, I would also think about looking at the percentages of international as previously discussed for the different programs, and as you apply how that's going to impact, I guess, your status and your application. But yeah, overall, again, pandemic impacted things, but again, as we move out of it, I think I'd look more about the specifics of the programs and what they're looking at in terms of their international makeup.
Any other thoughts on international students before we go for it, Harold? Then we'll do some final comments for everybody.
Yeah, I have to be honest with you. It was a very tough year for international students. I personally had three of my clients who I was very surprised sort of where they got in and where they didn't get in. And I think to speak to Susan's point, as an international student, you have to sort of run where daylight is. You have to spend a lot more time thinking about what schools will be receptive to me as an international student. And there are schools out there. I had great success again with Olin, WashU, St. Louis. I had a client of mine who got a full scholarship to Northeastern University, which many people have never heard of, but does a great job in terms of money, as well as getting people great jobs. So I think you have to look in that direction, because the reality is these other, the very top schools, it's really tough for international students right now.
Can I just add one thing on to what Harold said? I think it was especially tough for internationals this year because many of the internationals who were accepted last year and we were expecting to start in 2020 were able to get deferrals, and they went back in and was like, well, I have the spot at Wharton, but I'm going to try again at Harvard and Stanford. Or I know I'm going to Darden, but I really wanted to go somewhere better, so I'm going to apply again. So I think you had people who applied 2 years in a row and were just trying to up that admit they had from 2020 start when they got deferred for a year. And that made it a little bit harder perhaps for those who were trying for the first time because they didn't have that feedback that reapplicants had to be able to improve their applications.
All right, we are running out of time here. So I'm just going to run through real quick one last time and give all four of you one chance to just say, what is the one thing you'd like people to take away as far as how to use the rankings, how to think about the 2021 rankings, how you'd like to see them used. And I'm going to start with Marie on this one. Final thoughts.
Well, I actually, during the course of this conversation, Neil, I'm going to actually steal a phrase that you used. I'm going to reverse engineer what it is that you're looking for, right? Like, really be serious with yourself. Like, do I have to go to Stanford to become an entrepreneur? No, you don't, right? If that really is what you want to do with your life, there are a lot of schools that can get you there. So be really, I don't want to use the word mature, but be introspective and be really serious. Like, what do I really need? And then use the rankings sort of as a rough guide, especially the specialty rankings, which, as we've discussed, I think are a little bit more interesting and useful. But there are a lot of different ways to get to where you go, and don't let the rankings blind you or divert you off a cliff when there are other paths that you could follow.
Neil, any thoughts that Maria didn't already say for you?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. Again, just use the rankings as a guide, but again, think about the different programs, do a deep dive, really have those conversations and engage with admissions early and often. Whether it's the online events, whether it's the in-person events, go on the on-campus tours, go visit a class, sit in on a class. But then again, most importantly probably is speak with current students, speak with alums, and figure out, does their experience kind of like match the experience that you're seeking from a program? And if so, then that might be a good program for you to apply to.
Harold.
Yeah, I'm going to be a little snide here in the sense of make sure that it passes the smell test, quite honestly. The reality is nobody's thrown out of Harvard to accept. Just doesn't exist. Or maybe it does, I've just never seen it. So I think you have to recognize the latest rankings are just one data set. They are certainly imperfect. Maybe they allow you to look at a couple of other schools you didn't think about. But the reality is that once you start pulling all different information together, like Neil said, like Maria said, like Susan said, once you really start pulling all this information together, the reality is your own personal rankings are going to change quite a bit from the US News and World Report rankings.
And Susan.
Yeah, just, everyone has great things to say. Again, think about what career you want. Back into what you need to learn in business school. Look at those specializations, look at the career reports. And if money's important, drill down to those further down on the list. I'm talking like 10 to 30 or even below that, if money's important. So create your own top 10 list. Don't just drive from what someone else is doing there. Dig into that methodology, and that's not really what's important to you, I don't think, for the most part.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, especially live audience, asking questions, giving comments. Always hugely appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining us. Next session we're doing on the GMAT Club YouTube channel is What's So Special About MBB, McKinsey, Bain, BCG. So join us for that. If you haven't already subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. Again, for my favorite admissions consultants, Neil Chong, Veritas Prep, Harold Simansky, mbaMission, Maria, Wich, Vila, ApplicantLab.com, Susan, Cera, Stratus. Everybody books up fast. It's March. You want to get on these guys' roster for round 1, round 2. Start talking to them now. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And again, hit that subscribe button.
Thank you all.